In the heart of the savannah, nestled between towering baobabs and winding rivers, lay the village of Kwenim-Tai. Known for its storytellers and wise elders, it was a place where magic, tradition, and mystery were intertwined. Amidst the simple homes lived a man named Kwasi, famous across the lands for one peculiar reason: he had never told a lie. No one could recall a single untruth from his lips, not even as a child. His reputation grew so much that even the distant kingdoms whispered of his truthfulness. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, villagers would gather around the great fire to listen to Kwasi's stories. He never embellished, never exaggerated. His words were like the steady rhythm of the talking drums, pure and honest. One day, a rumor swept through the village like wildfire. The king of Kwenim-Tai, King Zinga, had heard of Kwasi and wanted to test his integrity. The king, known for his cunning, was determined to prove that even the most honest man had his limits. Whispers of the king's challenge reached Kwasi, but he remained unbothered. He had never needed to hide behind facades. Yet, a storm was brewing, one that would test his very soul. Morning after the rumor spread, the king's messengers arrived at Kwasi's door. They came with an urgent message from King Zinga, a demand that he come to the palace immediately. Dressed in his simple cloth, Kwasi made his way toward the majestic palace, towering above the village like a guardian of secrets. As he walked, villagers murmured amongst themselves. Would the king find a way to break Kwasi's truth? The palace gates opened with a groan as Kwasi stepped into the grand courtyard. Guards in vibrant Kent stood at attention, and servants hustled about, but all eyes were on him. The anticipation was thick, like the scent of rain before a storm. In the throne room, King Zinga sat high on his golden throne, his sharp eyes watching every movement. "So, this is the man who never lies," the king said, his voice echoing. "You must be very proud of your reputation." Kwasi bowed respectfully. "I live by truth, as the ancestors teach us." King Zinga smiled, but it wasn't warm. "We shall see. I have a challenge for you, Kwasi. If you can pass my test without telling a single lie, I will reward you with anything your heart desires. But if you fail, there will be consequences." Kwasi nodded, calm as ever. "I accept." King Zinga summoned Kwasi to the palace again. This time, the air was thick with tension. The king leaned forward on his throne, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Tell me, Kwasi," the king began. "You claim to never lie, but what if the truth could harm someone? Could you still be so honest then?" Kwasi remained still, considering the king's words. "Let me give you a situation," Nzinga continued, with a sly grin. "A traveler came to the village this morning, claiming that you owe him 5 goats. He says you borrowed them a year ago, and never returned them. Is this true?" The room fell silent, everyone waiting for Kwasi's response. A lie could save him from accusations, but his truthfulness was his identity. Without hesitation, Kwasi spoke. "I have never borrowed goats from any traveler." The king's grin widened. "But what if I had him here, in this very room, swearing by the gods? Would you still claim he lies?" Kwasi's calm never wavered. "I speak only of what I know to be true. If another man speaks against that, then perhaps there is confusion, but I cannot change my words to suit someone else's truth." King Zinga stared hard at Kwasi, but the man's expression remained unshaken. There were murmurs among the courtiers, but the king waved his hand dismissively. Very well, the king said. We shall see if you can maintain this honesty. Days passed, and rumors of the king's trap spread across the village. The people were divided. Some said Quasi's days of truth-telling were numbered, that no man could remain perfectly honest under such pressure. Others, who had long admired Quasi, believed in his ability to navigate the king's challenges. One evening, Quasi received a message from the palace. The king had prepared a special dinner in his honor, and he was invited as the guest of honor. Quasi, never one to decline hospitality, accepted the invitation. That night, the banquet hall was filled with music, laughter, and the finest food. King Nzinga sat at the head of the table, his eyes gleaming as Quasi arrived. "Come, Quasi," Nzinga called. "Tonight, we celebrate your truthfulness. But before we feast, I have one question for you." Quasi approached the king, sensing a deeper meaning behind his words. "Tell me," Nzinga continued, his voice smooth, "is it ever wise to tell a truth that could destroy someone you care about?" Quasi's brow furrowed. "The truth is not meant to destroy, but to enlighten." The king smirked. "We shall see. Enjoy your meal." As Quasi took his seat, a servant leaned over and whispered in his ear, "Beware of the king's tricks tonight." As the feast continued, the air in the banquet hall grew heavier. The musicians played louder, the laughter echoed, and yet, there was an undercurrent of tension. Quasi noticed the servants moving about in hurried whispers, and his instincts told him something was wrong. The king raised his goblet for a toast. "To truth, to honesty, and to our most honored guest, Quasi." He smiled, but Quasi could see the mischief in his eyes. The courtiers lifted their goblets and drank deeply. Quasi, however, paused. His goblet gleamed under the flickering candlelight, but something about it didn't feel right. The servant's earlier warning echoed in his mind, "Beware of the king's tricks tonight." King Nzinga, noticing Quasi's hesitation, leaned forward. "Why do you not drink, my friend? Do you not trust the king's hospitality?" Quasi smiled calmly. "I trust the gods, and I trust my instincts." He placed the goblet back on the table without drinking. The king's smile faltered for a moment. "You refuse my toast." "I refuse nothing, Your Majesty," Quasi replied. "But truth guides my actions, and I feel that drinking from this cup is not wise." A murmur swept through the room. Had Quasi just insulted the king? King Nzinga's face darkened as the tension in the room grew. He had not expected Quasi to defy him so openly. The courtiers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what would happen next. "You claim to be a man of truth, yet you refuse a simple toast." Nzinga's voice was cold, dangerous. The entire hall held its breath, waiting for Quasi's response. The weight of the king's anger was palpable. But Quasi, ever calm, met the king's gaze without flinching. "I refuse nothing, Your Majesty. But if my heart tells me something is wrong, I must heed that call. I mean no disrespect." King Nzinga's lips curled into a tight smile, though the anger in his eyes was unmistakable. He stood abruptly, causing everyone to fall silent. "Very well. Since you trust your instincts over my hospitality, let's put your trust to the test." He clapped his hands, and from the shadows, 2 guards emerged, dragging a trembling servant toward the center of the room. The servant was the same one who had warned Quasi earlier. "This man," the king said, pointing at the servant, "has committed an act of betrayal. He poisoned your cup, Kwasi. Now, you claim to always tell the truth, so tell me, should this man be punished or spared? The crowd gasped. The servant, pale and terrified, looked up at Kwasi with pleading eyes. The question was a trap, but Kwasi understood that truth was not only about facts, it was also about wisdom. Kwasi took a deep breath and spoke, his voice steady. This man has acted out of fear, not malice. If anyone is at fault, it is the one who planted that fear. He should not be punished for following orders. The king's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. The crowd watched in suspense, unsure of what the king would do next. King Nzinga stared at Kwasi for a long moment, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the arm of his golden throne. The silence was thick, and the tension in the room seemed to strangle the air. You speak of fear, the king finally said, his voice low and measured. You are a wise man, Kwasi, but I wonder if you truly understand the nature of fear. Nzinga stood, towering over the room, and addressed the court. Let me remind you all, in this kingdom, fear is necessary. Without it, respect falters, and without respect, chaos reigns. He turned to Kwasi, his voice suddenly softer but filled with menace. I will offer you a choice, Kwasi. If you continue to refuse to drink from the cup, the servant dies. But if you are the man of truth you claim to be, drink it, and prove that you trust my judgment. Gasps filled the hall. The king's ultimatum was clear. Either Kwasi drank and risked death, or he let an innocent man die. All eyes were on Kwasi. Even the musicians had stopped playing, the only sound now the crackling of the torches along the walls. Kwasi stood, his face calm yet grave. The king's trap was tightening, but Kwasi knew that truth was not just about the words he spoke. It was about the courage to act in the face of danger. I will drink from the cup, Kwasi said, his voice clear. But let the servant go. The king smiled victoriously, and the guards released the servant. All watched as Kwasi raised the poisoned goblet to his lips, the fate of his life hanging in the balance. Kwasi held the goblet, its cold metal brushing against his lips. The room was deathly silent, all eyes fixed on him. He took a small sip and lowered the cup. Nothing happened. The room remained still, and Kwasi's face did not change. The poison did not take him, and he stood as calm and composed as before. A murmur spread through the court, people exchanging puzzled glances. Had the poison not worked? The king's smile faded into confusion. He turned to one of his advisers, who leaned in and whispered in his ear, his face paling as he spoke. The king's expression hardened as he realized something had gone terribly wrong with his plan. Kwasi placed the goblet back on the table and spoke with calm authority. Truth always prevails, even in the face of death. The king clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath his royal composure. You should be dead. The cup was poisoned. Kwasi nodded. Perhaps the truth protects me, as it always has. The crowd erupted into whispers. Some believed Kwasi had been saved by the gods, while others speculated that the king's poison had failed. But no one could deny that Kwasi had passed the king's test. The king, however, was not so easily defeated. His face twisted in frustration, and he spoke through gritted teeth. This is not over, Kwasi. You may have escaped this test, but there are many more ways to prove a man's truth. The following morning, the king sent for Kwasi again, determined to break him. This time, the king devised a new plan. He took Kwasi deep into the forest, accompanied by only a handful of guards and advisers. As they ventured further, they came across a mighty hunter named Jabori, known throughout the kingdom for his skill. He had just returned from the bush, and strapped to his back was a massive leopard he had killed. The king greeted Jabori with a broad smile. "Ah, the great hunter. Tell me, Jabori, would you say that you are the best hunter in this land?" Jabori grinned. "I am indeed, Your Majesty. No one can match my skills." The king turned to Quasi with a sly grin. "And what do you think, Quasi? Is Jabori the best hunter in the land?" Quasi looked at the hunter, then at the king. He knew where this was going. "I cannot say who is the best hunter," Quasi said thoughtfully. "But I do know that the true measure of a hunter is not in the number of animals he kills, but in the wisdom he shows in sparing life when it is unnecessary to take it." Jabori frowned, insulted by Quasi's response. "Are you saying I should not have killed this leopard?" "I am saying that wisdom guides all actions, not just strength," Quasi replied calmly. The king smirked, waiting for a confrontation. But instead of arguing further, Jabori nodded, contemplating Quasi's words. The king's attempt to provoke conflict had failed again. After their return to the village, the king's frustration was palpable. He couldn't break Quasi's spirit, and his attempts to make him falter only seemed to backfire. The villagers, however, began to admire Quasi even more. His wisdom and calm in the face of adversity inspired them. But things took a dark turn when a terrible drought hit the kingdom. The crops withered, the rivers dried up, and the livestock began to die. The people were desperate, and many turned to the king for help, but his solutions were harsh. Taxes were raised, and resources hoarded for the palace. The villagers, feeling abandoned by their king, began to look to Quasi for guidance. They came to him in the night, seeking wisdom. "What can we do?" an elder asked. "The king takes from us, but offers nothing in return. Should we revolt?" Quasi shook his head. "Revolting only brings destruction. The truth is, we must find a way to work together, to survive this hardship." "But how?" asked a young woman. "The king listens to no one." Quasi thought for a moment. "We will not fight the king, but we will not allow him to destroy us either. Sometimes, the best way to resist is to live by our own truths, quietly, until the time is right." The villagers nodded, trusting in Quasi's wisdom. They began to organize in secret, helping each other survive the drought without the king's knowledge. The drought continued, and the tension between the king and his people grew. But King Nzinga's focus was still on breaking Quasi. He summoned Quasi to the palace for one final test. "I have heard rumors, Quasi," the king said with a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "Rumors that you have been leading the people against me, in secret." Quasi remained calm. "I have led no rebellion, Your Majesty. I have only spoken the truth." The king's eyes narrowed. "We shall see. I have a final test for you. If you pass it, I will concede defeat. But if you fail, you will not leave this palace alive." Quasi nodded, prepared for whatever came next. The king clapped his hands, and a guard brought in a young boy, bound and frightened. The king pointed at the boy. "This child is accused of stealing from the royal granary. The punishment is death. But I offer you a chance to save him. All you must do is say he did not steal, and I will release him." The room fell silent. The boy's terrified eyes looked to Quasi for salvation. But Quasi knew the boy had indeed stolen from the granary, out of hunger. If Kwasi lied, the boy would live, but his own truth would be compromised. Kwasi knelt in front of the boy, looking him directly in the eyes. "Did you steal from the granary?" he asked gently, his voice calm and full of understanding. The boy hesitated, his lip trembling. He glanced at the king, then back at Kwasi. Tears welled up in his eyes as he finally nodded. "Yes, I did. I was hungry, and my family had nothing to eat." The king's grin grew wider, satisfied that he had finally trapped Kwasi. "You see. Even the boy admits it. Now, Kwasi, what will you do? If you say he didn't steal, the boy lives, but you will have told your first lie. If you tell the truth, he will die. Choose wisely." The room was silent. The boy's life hung in the balance, and all eyes were on Kwasi. He rose slowly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, then resting on the king. "I will not lie," Kwasi said firmly. "The boy did steal, but he did so out of desperation, not malice. There is truth in that." The king's smile faltered slightly. "Then he must die, according to the law." Kwasi took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with compassion. "Your Majesty, laws are meant to guide us, but they are not infallible. A child who steals to survive is not a criminal, but a victim of circumstance. Punishing him for his hunger would be an act of cruelty, not justice. True wisdom is knowing when mercy must take precedence over the letter of the law." The court held its breath, waiting for the king's response. Even Nzinga, for all his cunning, was momentarily taken aback by Kwasi's words. The truth rang so clearly, so powerfully, that even the king's cruel games seemed to lose their power. King Nzinga's face darkened, the weight of Kwasi's words sinking into him. The court was silent, waiting for the king to make his decision. He had never been one to yield to anyone, let alone a simple villager. Yet, in that moment, it was clear that Kwasi had bested him, not with force, but with truth. The king stared hard at Kwasi, his pride struggling against the undeniable wisdom before him. After what felt like an eternity, Nzinga raised his hand and spoke, his voice cold but resolute. "The boy shall live." A wave of relief swept through the room. The boy collapsed into tears, thanking Kwasi over and over again. The villagers, who had gathered outside the palace, cheered when they heard the news. But the king wasn't finished yet. "You have passed every test, Kwasi," Nzinga said, his tone bitter. "You are indeed a man who never lies. You have earned the respect of the people and the court. But know this, truth may have saved you today, but it is a dangerous path. It makes enemies of those who fear it." Kwasi bowed respectfully. "Truth may be dangerous, Your Majesty, but it is the only path that leads to peace." The king said nothing more, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of grudging respect. He waved his hand, dismissing Kwasi. The test was over. As Kwasi left the palace, the villagers gathered around him, praising his wisdom and courage. But Kwasi, ever humble, simply smiled and said, "The truth belongs to us all. It is not mine to own, but to share." From that day on, Kwasi's legend grew even more powerful, not just in Kwenim Tai, but across the lands. People came from far and wide to seek his counsel, knowing that his words were pure and unshakable. And though the king never challenged him again, it was said that Nzinga himself, in his quiet moments, often pondered the power of truth. And so, Kwasi's legacy endured, a man who never lied, not because it was easy, but because he understood that truth, though sometimes difficult, was the strongest force of all.